Hi there, nice to have you here. Have you ever wondered why there are so many laws and why many people say it must be like this, there are no alternatives? In this video, I introduce a new perspective, the OboxPlanet. It's a thought experiment and a tool for thinking. It helps you rethink politics and see that there are always alternatives. We begin here with the basics. Later on the website OboxPlanet.com and in seminars, you can visit the planet. My name is Thomas Jacob and I'm your host today. But enough words, let's get started and hopefully soon in a seminar. Why the name OboxPlanet? Imagine you talk to a farmer from the Middle Ages. A tenant farmer who has to work on the same small farm all his life. He knows hard work, fear and superstition. His boss is the prince and the boss of the prince is the king, and the farmer believes every person has its fixed place, otherwise there will be chaos. Now you're telling him about our world. People can travel freely, choose their jobs, start businesses and vote out their government. He will probably tell you you're crazy. Without fixed rules and without a fixed place in society, that never works. And today, if I tell you today people can live together peacefully without the state and without the state police and judiciary, then many say, impossible, that would end in chaos. Why is that? We usually think within the limits of what we already know inside the box of the familiar. For the peasant, the box was king, priests and peasants. Today, our box is the state and its laws enforced by the police. Anything outside that box first feels strange, unrealistic or even impossible. And that's almost always how new ideas work. First they are unimaginable, then unfamiliar, then debatable, and one day they feel completely normal. Let's get more specific. Think of any political topic, immigration, health, social security. All discussions are the same. We take what we know, the current situation, and ask ourselves, does an improvement require more or less laws, more or less taxes, in short, more or less state involvement? That's exactly what we want to tackle differently today. We take the individual problems and put them, figuratively speaking, in a box, and we look for solutions outside the box. By the way, this out-of-the-box thinking is used in business life when new, original ideas are required outside the familiar thinking. Strictly speaking, we don't just put individual topics but the whole world into the box, close the lid and respectfully put it aside for a moment. Now, outside the box, let's imagine a planet, the outside-the-box planet or the OboxPlanet. It's a copy-paste of the Earth, has the same size, seas, continents, animals and even people, but it lacks one thing. There are no states. No legislators, no bureaucracy, no taxes and no military. And of course questions immediately arise. Who builds the roads? Who cares for the poor? Who provides for law and order? This is exactly what we want to find out with a visit to this planet, an imaginary discovery journey. A quick note at the beginning. The term and the idea OboxPlanet are my creation, but I don't want to adorn myself with other people's feathers. The idea of a stateless society has been systematically studied for almost exactly 50 years, especially in the USA. Why exactly then and why in the USA? In the USA, as everywhere, the states kept growing and growing. In the 1960s, at the time of the Vietnam War and great social tensions, many things began to falter. And it is precisely in such times that people begin to think about new and unfamiliar solutions. One extreme solution, namely much more state involvement, was not original. It already existed in the communist Eastern Bloc and it was not very inspiring. And so various scientists asked themselves at the same time, what happens if we privatize all state functions? We come back to these pioneers in the picture at the end in the reading recommendations. but since then there has been a rapidly growing number of studies and books. In the real world, we have seen something remarkable: the election of Javier Milei as president of Argentina. Milei has said that his inspiration is a society without a state, a world similar to the OboxPlanet. He has brought the idea of radical liberty to millions, not only in Argentina, but internationally, for example, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he referenced thinkers such as Murray Rothbard, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and Hernando de Soto. You could say that Milei swaps the usual political utopias, whether left, right, green, red or brown, for one clear idea: radical freedom like on the OboxPlanet. And this seems to really appeal to the young people. Among voters under 25, he got about 70% of the votes. Milei says that for many young Argentinians today, being rebellious is no longer about left or right, it's about freedom. Next topic: a world without states is like a new sport, a game with new rules. As we know from sports, it's just more fun when you know the rules of the game. That's why we make a short stop at the orbital base on our way to the OboxPlanet. There we will learn the basic rules according to which the OboxPlanet works. And the nice thing is, there is only one rule, and you already know it. You learned it as a toddler. It is simply the way we deal with each other in our private lives. Because on the OboxPlanet there is no state, there is only private life. So what is missing on the OboxPlanet are government rules, laws, ordinances, decrees, licenses, and there is no state police to enforce them. Wait a minute, you might think. Without the state there is no order, no security, there is traffic chaos and the survival of the fittest. Wait a minute, I reply. You are right about one thing. Much of what the state does today responds to real needs, especially the need for law and order. But having a need does not mean that only one institution, the state, can satisfy it. That's exactly what the OboxPlanet is about. We can illustrate it like this. The OboxPlanet stands on a stool with 3 legs. The seat is the most important rule of all, and the 3 legs are the 3 ways this rule is applied in everyday life. The rule is called ZAP, short for Zero Aggression Principle. In simple terms, no violence, no threats, no forced actions. And the 3 legs are property, contract, and the neutral judge. ZAP holds these 3 pillars together and gives them a common norm. Nothing must break this norm. You can think of it like the law of gravity in physics. Gravity does not tell objects what to do, but it limits everything they can do. In the same way, the ZAP limits all rules on the OboxPlanet and keeps them consistent. The highest rule on the OboxPlanet is the Zero Aggression Principle, and it's very simple. You can do whatever you want as long as you do not threaten or hurt anyone. That means no stealing, no threats, no violence, except for self-defense. And the little ghost Zappy stands for exactly this idea, the happy spirit of peaceful living together. Because the Zero Aggression Principle is about non-aggression, we first need to be clear about what aggression actually means. In this context, aggression means the threat or use of physical violence against somebody who did not invite it. In short, unwanted physical force. That's why the following are not okay: robbery, kidnapping, rape, theft, murder, and similar acts. On the other hand, some forms of physical force are okay, like a boxing match, martial arts, rough sports, or games. Why? Because everyone involved has agreed to it. And of course, you are allowed to defend yourself against criminals. These scenes show something important. In everyday life today, we already live a lot like the Zappy. We can do whatever we want, sing, talk, work or play, as long as we do not hurt anyone. And the idea behind Zappy is very old. Many religions teach it as well. We know it as the golden rule: do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. The OboxPlanet is not a paradise. There are also bad people. There are robbers, thieves, scammers, blackmailers, and even murderers. They are few, but they matter. And that is why they get a mascot of their own, the prick, short for private criminal or private coercion. And yes, the double meaning is intended. The prick interferes everywhere. He steals and hurts people, breaks and falsifies contracts, and tries to corrupt judges. One of the main reasons people created states was to fight exactly these private criminals. And that is why we will return to the topic later in the chapter about the state. For now, let's move on. Next, we look at the three pillars of a private law society, namely property, contract, and the neutral judge. And if you're new to this, don't worry. You don't need to remember every detail right now. The goal is just to get familiar with the terms and the ideas, because they will keep coming up again and again. First, property. In a world without a state, everything belongs either to individual people or to groups, like families, cooperatives, or companies. And that includes land, lakes, rivers, and even parts of the sea. And that's why we could also call this a private property society, not just a private law society. But then the big question is, how does property start without breaking the zero aggression principle? And the answer is surprisingly simple. If something belongs to no one and I start using it peacefully, then it becomes mine. Because if it did not belong to anyone before, I'm not taking it away from anyone, so there is no conflict. This idea is called original appropriation or homesteading. Now, some say the first thing we homestead is our own body because we were the first to use it. And that actually makes sense. Put it simply, who else should it belong to? A slave owner? Of course not. But to be precise, the body is a special case because unlike land, it was never unowned and it cannot be given away or transferred. We are inseparably connected to our bodies. But for everything outside our body, however, homesteading is easy to understand. In the past, it was mainly about land. If I take unused land and peacefully build a house, plant potatoes, or put up a fence for my chicken, I'm clearly saying, this is mine. Today, it's less about new land and more about one big question: who owns what? And again, the answer leads back to the same idea. On the OboxPlanet, we will see exactly how this works. Next question, what can I do with my property? And we can illustrate the answer here. Anything goes as long as I do not violate the property of others, the ZAP principle. I'll give you an example. I am allowed to destroy my TV with my hammer, but I'm not allowed to destroy your TV or your head, even if it's my hammer. Next topic, contracts. A contract simply explains who owns what. We mainly use contracts when ownership changes. Example, you give me an apple and I give you an egg. We have exchanged ownership. Strictly speaking, this is already a contract, but it's so simple and clear that we do not need to write anything down. It's called a tacit contract. But if I borrow money from you, it makes sense to write a few things down. How much money? When will it be paid back? And is there any interest? So what can be written in a contract? Once again, very simple. Anything goes as long as it does not violate the ZAP principle. And everyone agrees voluntarily. Example, I may agree with you that we will both have a boxing match, but we cannot agree with each other that we rob or beat up our neighbor. And what if things are unclear and we have disputes? Then the next topic comes into play, the neutral judge. When two people argue, they usually need a third person to help solve the conflict, a neutral judge or mediator. And one thing is obvious, this person must not be involved in the conflict. Just imagine you and I argue and I get to decide who is right. Does anyone think this is fair? Even toddlers understand this. And yet, there is one huge area in our lives where one party to the conflict also chooses or is the judge at the same time. The question is, where does this happen? Exactly. It's the idea of the state. Here is something too important to understand. The state is both a player and a referee at the same time. If I have a conflict with the state and go to court, the judge who decides the case is chosen and paid for by the state. This does not mean that the state always wins. Sometimes the state actually loses in court, but the basic rule stays the same. The state is the final judge in cases that involve itself. And that brings us directly to the next chapter. What exactly is the difference on Earth? Can you spot the three differences in these pictures? On the left you see the Earth, on the right you see the OboxPlanet. First difference, down here at the bottom on Earth, the judge decides his own case. On the OboxPlanet the judge is neutral, just like we explained before. Second difference, up here on the seat cushions we see the rules of how things are ordered. On the OboxPlanet there is only one basic rule, the zap. On Earth there is zap plus an extra rule called mock. We already know what zap means. What exactly is the mock? The zero aggression principle means that no one is allowed to use violence except for self-defense. Mock means monopoly of coercion. Gewalt, Monopol in German. That is the nature, the essence of the state. The state and only the state may legally use coercion to enforce its decrees, with fines and ultimately with the threat of imprisonment. So we have down here the monopoly on the use of force, and up here strict non-violence. And these two principles are mutually exclusive. And that is why there are two legal systems on Earth. Up here, civil law or private law regulates the dealings between private individuals. Down here, public law regulates people's dealings with the state, that is to say, the way the state deals with its citizens. Private law is essentially an application of the zero aggression principle. Anything is permitted as long as no violence is used, and all obligations arise from voluntary agreements and contracts. Public law, by contrast, is based on state legislation. Such laws are inherently coercive. Every state rule ultimately relies on the threat of punishment if it is not obeyed. Penalties include, for example, fines, license withdrawals, seizures or imprisonment. In short, every state rule ultimately relies on the use or threat of coercion without exceptions. Wait a minute, you might think. That sounds rather radical. Well then, I invite you to construct a counter example. Imagine a public authority issuing a rule, a regulation, directive, decree, technical standard, or whatever form it may take, and at the same time saying, it doesn't matter if you don't comply. That would not be a state rule. At best, it would be a recommendation. There is no law without coercion. There is no state without a monopoly on force. The state is and has the monopoly on the use of force. Wait a second, you might think. It's not only the state that uses violence, you're forgetting the private criminals. And that's exactly why the state was created, a powerful leviathan that is supposed to provide for law and order. The first problem with this line of reasoning is the assumption that only the state can provide for law and order. This is wrong. We can easily imagine how private companies can provide for law and order, and we can even point to many examples in history and in the present world. Hold on, you probably think. Private judges, private police. How is that supposed to work? Well, I agree. It's an unfamiliar idea, certainly. But the solution is surprisingly simple. I have posted a separate YouTube video on this topic, and we will dive into it in much more detail in the seminar after the first break. But you can already look forward to that. Problem 2 with the argument is that security only accounts for a small part of the state's activities. In Switzerland, just 6% of taxpayers' money is used for this. The remaining 94% of the budget is allocated to so-called positive rights, i.e. claims to the state for pensions, healthcare, schools, transport, etc. But the state can only spend money that it has taken away from someone first, which means that some pay and others collect. And now it gets really exciting. In this area of positive rights, the state technically behaves in the same way as private criminals. It simply has different names for its actions. Let's make a couple examples. If I go to my neighbor and say, from now on you pay me 20% of your wages, that is called coercion, and I'll go to prison, if not to a madhouse. If the state does the same, it's called tax sovereignty. Or if I print money in the basement to pay my bills, that means counterfeiting money, and for this crime the state has no mercy. If the state pays its bills with the printing press, it's called monetary and economic policy. Or if I tell my neighbor that he has to work in a retirement home for a few months, and instead of money he gets a wet handshake, that would be forced labor. If the state requires this because he refuses military service, it's called civilian service. So the state is a wolf in a sheep's clothing, and that's why it gets this lovely mascot. Now you might say, but apparently people agree with the state. In everyday life it requires very little violence. But the reason for this is simple and not very romantic. Everyone knows that the state knows no mercy if necessary. Let's take as an example taxes and ask ourselves how much is paid voluntarily. Let's say the state suddenly declares whether you pay taxes or not has no consequences for you. How much tax revenues do you think the state would get? How much would you pay? And if I resist state orders, matters can turn ugly very quickly. Even the last person at the back of the room understood this during the COVID period. We can therefore say there are two types of criminals, or more precisely two types of convicts on earth. The classic pricks, which have carried out violence like thieves, robbers, murderers, and what I call rebels against the state, who are punished without ever having used violence. For example, for tax offenses, drug use, violations of licensing or reporting obligations, or insulting officials and the like. Back to the overview, here we see how the state interferes in all three pillars of human society. In the case of property, for example, the state takes taxes or tells me what I can do with my land and my property. In the case of freedom of contract, for example, he tells me I cannot work for less than the minimum wage. And here on the right, we have already discussed the state is the supreme judge over itself. We can now say the seat is divided between the public sector mock and the rest remains for the private sector zap, and both are constantly fighting for supremacy. And this fight between the state and private life has a name: politics. Because every new law, every tax and every regulation enlarges the public sphere and restricts private freedom. Now, of course, there are many reasons for all these laws, but the reasons for the state interventions are not the issue today. We want to concentrate on life on the stateless OboxPlanet. But before we land there, we take one last glance back. A few facts and examples help us see which ideas we need to leave behind when we think outside the box. If you look at history, you will notice today's states have only existed for a short period of time, and they have grown very quickly. Let's take Switzerland as an example, firstly because I know it well, and secondly because it is often considered a model for success. Switzerland is relatively wealthy, free, and democratic. Many problems of other countries also exist there, but often later or less severely. Question: how old is Switzerland? Two dates, 1291 and 1848, in between the so-called Confederation, was not a state in the modern sense, but a loose defensive alliance of independent cantons with their subject territories, a small NATO, so to speak. If 200 years ago I would have called somebody, "Hey you, Swiss," he would probably have protested and said, No, I'm from Bern or from Muri or whatever. And how did the federal state come into being in 1848? Spoiler alert, it was not a bottom-up surge of unity and patriotism. There was a civil war in 1847, and the founding of a central state was violent and against the will of a number of cantons. And traces of this emergence can still be felt today. Switzerland is not a special case in this respect neither. Other nation-states of the time, such as Germany in the north or Italy in the south, also emerged through wars or with the help of wars. Be that as it may, since then there has been a federal state instead of a confederation of cantons, and this state can no longer be overlooked. After the founding of the state in 1848, a total of around 3 francs in taxes had to be paid to the municipality, canton and federal governments for every 100 francs of income. Today it is around 32 francs plus compulsory health insurance and pension fund contributions, so we are easily at a 40% tax rate. And the situation is similar for all Western industrialized countries. In francs per capita, income has grown about 14-fold since 1850, and government spending per capita has grown 150-fold. Here we are not interested in exact decimals, we only care about orders of magnitude. And if we look at what this is spent on, the greatest shares go to social security, health, education and public transport. What expenses have existed since the beginning, as early as 1850? This 6% of government spending on the basic functions of government: security, defense and law and order, life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, as the Americans describe it. What about the other tasks? Since when has the state taken them over? In general, very recently. Here are a few examples. The first federal university, 1855, the nationalization of the railroads around the turn of the century, Social Security, 1948, other social programs in the mid-60s, and compulsory health insurance in the mid-90s. And let's not forget the National Bank in 1906. What can we learn from this for the OboxPlanet? Much of what the state does today used to be privately organized not so long ago. On the OboxPlanet, the difference is simple. Nothing was ever nationalized because there is no state. And we can learn something else. Even though today's state programs often feel like great achievements which will always exist, history shows that big things can change, even in ways people once thought were impossible. Let's look at just 2 examples. If I had told someone 500 years ago that slavery would one day be banned almost everywhere, they would have told me, forget it. Slavery had existed for thousands of years, yet within just 100 years, most countries passed laws to end it. Or take a more recent example. I grew up during the Cold War, when the world was divided into a freer West and a communist East bloc. Back then, the Berlin Wall seemed permanent, And if someone had told me, like in 1980, that I would see the fall in my lifetime, I would have laughed and said it was more likely that cows would learn how to fly. And yet it happened almost overnight and with relatively little violence. So, what are the chances of an OboxPlanet revolution? Once again, that's not the topic of today. The point is simply this. History has a habit of surprising us with things that once seemed unthinkable. Or, to paraphrase Wilhelm Busch, but here as everywhere you'll find things rarely turn out as designed. Back to reality with a few examples from daily life to illustrate some things that do not exist on the OboxPlanet. Let's take an average workday. We start the day with an alarm clock which runs on state-produced electricity. This is followed by a shower with public water heated by natural gas, which is highly taxed and strictly regulated. Even the vitamin tablets after brushing your teeth are controlled or prohibited if they are not state certified. At breakfast we have bread, butter, bacon, milk, eggs, all taxed, regulated and sometimes subsidized at the same time. The way to work or school is via state roads or public transport. And at the workplace, forms, permits, tax rules and accounting regulations are waiting. Question. Take a look around you right now, where you are, and ask yourself, of everything you see, wear or need, house, car, clothes, computer, food, what has the state actually produced? Or as my friend Sandro Lemon once said, everything we can touch, smell, hear, taste or see is regulated and or taxed by the state. And here are a few examples in more detail. Let's start in Europe. Imagine you have a simple idea for a new pacifier. One would think that it could hardly be more harmless. Immediately, the EU standard 12586 greets you. That's 52 A4 pages, which regulates just the length of the dummy chain. In addition, there are hundreds of pages of other standards, regulations and test reports. Conclusion? Nobody forbids you your project, but everybody asks, do you really want to do that? Or you live in South America, for example, in Lima, Peru, and want to sell clothes and register your store correctly with the state. Harmless, right? The Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto has done this with his students. Result, it took 289 days with over 200 visits to the authorities. And what happens if you don't sign up? Then you work in the shadow economy, are susceptible to blackmail at any time and have hardly any access to banks, insurance companies and payment companies. And speaking of corruption, it is bred by laws and it can only be combated sustainably by dismantling laws. Let's say that despite all obstacles, you make it that far. Tax season arrives. In the USA, often called the land of the free, this means about 2,500 pages of tax laws and tens of thousands of extra rules with exceptions and special cases which all have to be considered. You start asking yourself, is this really worth it? Do I even have time for my actual job anymore? And there is something else you quietly know. With so many rules, the state can make your life difficult whenever it wants, just by using the laws. The individual rules and taxes may be small and even understandable, but as a clever guy once said, it's like in the fairy tale of Gulliver's Travels. Small threats hold you tight until you cannot move anymore. The arteries of civilization clog, and in the end there is nothing more you can do. And the consequences of taxes and regulations on prosperity are dramatic. Economically relative free countries have 10 times per capita income of non-free countries, and behind these figures are people who hunger, freeze, suffer and die early. And here we are also talking about very relative freedom. The examples above from the EU and the USA are from countries on the far right of the graphic. And on the OboxPlanet, here is the average prosperity somewhere up there. But the state not only hinders prosperity, it also interferes in the last corners of personal life. Career, pension, marriage, children, place of residence, career choice, saving or inheritance, almost every decision today is influenced, restricted, or even prohibited by laws, taxes, and regulations. And even if we assume that the legislators mean well, everything has undesirable side effects. Old age pensions were once meant as a safety net for people who really need them. Over time, they have turned into something more like a comfortable hammock for many, even for people who are already well off. The money mostly comes from young people who at the same time worry that there may be nothing left for them later. The result? Pessimism, frustration, fear about the future, and a politically fueled conflict between the generations. Reproductive laws are laws about life or non-life. They mean that politicians determine whether babies are allowed to come to Earth or have to push clouds forever. According to the will of the Swiss politicians, our two young children, Jamie and Nikita, would still be with the angels. Fortunately, there are still countries in Europe with more liberal laws. Talking of preventing babies, in Switzerland, abortions are covered by mandatory health insurance, which means that everyone who pays insurance premiums helps finance them. Last year, about 12,500. One last funny story from the madhouse of politics. In the 1990s, the Federal Council seriously suggested that grandparents might need an official license to babysit their own grandchildren. Luckily, the idea became known as Granny License, and then laughter killed it. Now you may be thinking, but these laws were created with good intentions and have a purpose. That may be true, but as I said before, just because there is a problem or a need does not mean that the state has to solve it. For some of the examples discussed, you can find on the OboxPlanet private quality seals, product and professional liability insurance, saving plans and pension, and much more. Things like taxes, reproductive laws, or licenses for babysitters, on the other hand, are at best topics for horror movies on the OboxPlanet. Now imagine a world with no retirement age, no state rules about marriage or having kids, no job licenses, no settlement rules, and no taxes. And then ask yourself, how would you live your life? What would you do differently than today? Those are the rules of the OboxPlanet and the key differences to Earth. Now the fun part begins. Welcome to the adventures on the OboxPlanet, and see you there. Oh, I almost forgot the literature recommendations. You can find some of them in the free booklet Hoppe Unplugged via the website of the same name, hoppeunplugged.com.